Welcome to today's episode of Resiliency, the podcast. Today's guest helps doctors to find resiliency in the face of burnout across the healthcare industry. I cannot think of a more noble or important cause right now. Now, beyond that, she is a well-researched and highly respected therapist and a transformational leadership coach. She holds degrees from Smith College and a coaching certificate from Brown University School for Continuing Education. And then she went on to deepen her education with additional training in team coaching and completed the great Brené Brown's Dare to Lead curriculum. Now, today's guest really spent years deeply understanding how our mindset and our thinking impacts our experiences. She draws from Buddhist philosophy and then goes all the way to really research-based works like the work of Carol Dweck and the aforementioned Miss Brené Brown. And so from that, she brings a really broad perspective to her work. And as she does that, it distills down into something really important for our resiliency audience, which is how do people in the healthcare industry face burnout and find resilience in that face. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm so excited to dive in. Please welcome the great, the brilliant, Miss Sarah Carlan.
Oh my goodness, that was quite an intro. Thank you.
We're so happy to have you.
Thank you. I'm so excited to be here. This is wonderful.
Sarah, we're really thrilled that you're here with us today, and we're ready to jump and dive into what you do and get nuggets and words of wisdom and insight. But, something that's really key to all of the work we do together is the concept of resilience and resiliency. So we're curious, and our listeners certainly are curious, what does resilience mean to you?
I use the metaphor of surfing, that the waves of life are going to come whether we want them to or not. And as a surfer, we need to be agile and strong and also able to fall down, crash, get back up. And so just being able to ride those waves versus feeling stiff and wanting to control a situation to be the way that we imagine we can handle it. That's resiliency for me.
It's really a beautiful way to describe it because you can, people can visualize the wave, you riding the wave. We had a guest on in a previous podcast, and he talked about the willow tree and how the willow tree has to move and shift and be agile, flexible, nimble in the wind. So, it's the same kind of thing. It's you have to adapt as you're moving forward. So it's a beautiful picture. Thank you.
You're welcome. And I think the more you do it, like the stronger you get and the better you get at it. I think that our culture in recent years has wanted a flat surface. And that's just not the reality. Like we don't get to choose that.
I love that our culture wants a flat surface. I agree. I think we're all seeking this kind of homeostasis, but
yes.
And I keep reminding myself that was not promised. Nobody told us like, hey, come to life. It'll be a pudding party. Like that wasn't it.
No, definitely not.
Which brings me to, and I love your metaphor of surfing. And I agree, Dr. Kelly, it does remind me of that willow tree. And in both cases, what I liked that you said, Sarah, you said be able to crash, to smash out on those waves. Yes. And Dr. Kelly, that willow tree, those leaves are gone. They fly away every year. And so where I want to take us with this conversation, Sarah, because it's so important right now. People who are helping our healthcare industry, it's insane. So when they crash, when they burn out, I guess what I want to find out first, let's go to the origin. Look, we got to dig deep to understand how did your roots grow? So how did you get into helping these people see the crash, get around the crash, and learn to surf in the healthcare industry?
Yeah. Well, I've been adjacent to medicine for most of my adult life. I'm married to a primary care doc. We met in college. So I was, adjacent to all of the training and his career as he's moved forward. And there was, despite all the other ways I was serving, I was always pulled toward this sense that this could be so much easier, right? There are things that doctors are not given in their training that if they had these skills, if they had these mindsets, their job could be so much easier. They could serve in a way that would feel better to them. And, in my journey, I was like raising kids and doing all sorts of other things in my work. And when I pivoted to coaching, I said to myself, I want to serve the leaders who are on the front lines doing really high burnout, high stakes work. And because I can speak the language of physicians, right? I understand their mindset. It just became a natural place for me to serve. So although I have educators and nonprofit leaders and folks in other professions as clients, I'm really doubled down on supporting leadership at all levels of development. So I work with med students, I teach residents, I work with early career professionals and also mid and late career professionals as well. So that's what drove me. I was like, I see this need. It doesn't have to be this hard.
So that's your backstory and that's your passion. You saw this gap, you saw it was present right in your own home. So how do I fix this? Because you've got this innate desire to fix things.
Yeah.
So can you tell us, how are you helping those doctors become more effective at their practice? Like, what are you doing?
Yeah. So I'm, in addition to individual coaching, I am working right now to train residents in this skill set. So wellness has become a hot issue amongst, in training of physicians, right? In both in med school and the residency area. A lot of it has been focused on kind of teaching residents like, oh, make sure you have passions outside of work and spend time with your family and go to a yoga class. And there's been a lot of pushback against that, a feeling like the system is broken. Why should I have to change? If the system would be better at what it needed to do, then I wouldn't be so stressed out. And so what I really wanted to focus on is teaching medical providers how to notice the stressors, notice the thing, whether that's a story or an underlying belief that is really draining them, right? So it's not the EMR, electronic medical record or insurance companies, et cetera. Those are stressors they can't control. But what are the stressors they can control? So noticing, like, what's the story that emerges when I have a frustrating interaction with a patient? What is the belief about myself that emerges when I have a patient who isn't taking their medication or doesn't want to engage in treatment? And those are the stressors they can manage. So I talk about it as, how do they meet the moment, right? Those moments as they arise, how are they choosing to meet them? Are they choosing to go down the rabbit hole and deepen the belief about themselves or deepen the story? Or are they noticing like, oh, wait a minute, this is emerging for me and I'm going to choose. I have choice here. This is where I have choice, and engaging with those in a different way. And so when I do that work individually with medical providers, they're really able to identify, this thing is stressing me out. I had a provider that could not finish her notes. Like, she just had the hardest time at the end of her day completing her charts, closing the notes. And she had been through all sorts of other coaching, managing her time, etc. And really what it became about was that she had a story about how the electronic medical record was getting in the way of patient care. And once she was able to shift that story and have a different relationship with the electronic medical record, she was able to finish her notes. So it wasn't as simple as that, right? It took many sessions to get there, but it was that shift that was able to relieve a drain on her energy, because as the notes weren't finished, they were always in the back of her head. She was always thinking about herself as, not efficient, not organized. And all of those pieces were draining her energy. And when she was able to make this shift, all that energy that was being drained was then redirected into patient care, whereas where she wanted that energy to be. And then that just builds on itself.
I love what you've just said, because doctors are focused to understand and spot triggers in other people, triggers in conditions, triggers in symptoms. And what you are doing is helping them focus on triggers within themselves. So I've got two voices going on in their head, theirs on them and theirs on their patient. And how do you get through the noise?
Yeah, exactly.
It strikes me too that it is like such a that literature thematic theme, right? Is like man versus nature or man versus self. And you've got all these
Yes.
people who are like, man, it's man versus nature. It's the system,
Yeah,
man. It's how they're doing it. It's
totally.
technology. It's what they're doing. But what we're boiling it down to, and I think this is commonplace for resilience, turns out
Mhm.
it's man versus self.
Yeah.
Turns out we got to look at how we do that. So with that, since what you're bringing is such an amazing awareness that can be used every day in it, like you said, it's simple in that it's so easily accessible, and then it's
Yeah.
difficult in that you got to practice and practice and practice.
Yeah. And
So
practice and practice and practice.
in that simplicity, can you help us look as an overarching, if I were a young medical student or a veteran doctor, what are those signs I'm looking for? Let's look kind of overarching in this man versus self. What are those signs of burnout that I'm looking for to go, hey, I got to slow down and look at this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the first thing that arises for many people is this sense of irritability, right? Like they're just living in a constant state of irritability that they can't put their finger on, right? Or they are trying to put their finger on it, right? So they're trying to name the thing that's making them irritated. And as they resolve it, the irritability doesn't resolve. Resentment is the other thing that I name. If you are noticing yourself feeling resentful, it probably means your boundaries are being crossed on a regular basis. And that's a recipe for burnout. The other indicator for me is when they're looking for an out, right? Could I work fewer days? Could I work fewer hours? Could I have fewer patients? Could I be doing something else entirely? Which is huge when you're talking about the fact that most folks have spent the better part of $500,000 and, 8 to 15 years of their lives training to do the thing that they're doing. And then for them to say, like, I don't know if I can do this anymore. Those are, and the folks that are saying, I don't know if I can do this anymore are like really like, I would say like they're Kentucky fried. Like they're really at the edge of burnout. I would love to see it more when they're just kind of noticing a sense of irritability. A lot of the young female physicians I work with, they will name for me that they're feeling a strong sense of imposter syndrome, right? Like, I'm not good enough. I can't do this. Everyone else has figured it out and I haven't. Those types of things are what's coming up for them.
I'm fascinated by Kentucky Fried. I'm stuck on that because that's, you know what I mean? Because like, it's what a great way to say, like, please find yourself or find help before you are full out
Before you
fried.
are.
And and really you're speaking. So I want to go off script for just a minute and just dig into this for a minute, because a lot of our listeners are business leaders. A lot of our listeners own companies or they run teams or they do those things. And I got to tell you, when you're talking about these, you said irritability, resentment, looking for an out. Okay.
Yes.
And I want to ask you, Sarah, you're the expert here from the employer standpoint. Like, what do I do when my gals get Kentucky Fried? Like, how do you pull that back? Because I understand from the individual coaching standpoint what needs to be done. There's a therapeutic process. But when we look at this organizationally, do you have any advice?
Yeah, I think curiosity is the most important element that we can embody as leaders, right? To continue to get curious with the folks that we're leading, to help both ourselves and them understand more deeply what's showing up for them, right? So often employers will say like, well, what can we do to make this work for you? Which is a lovely question, right? It's a very kind question, but it doesn't help folks get to the underlying thing that is stressing them out, that is impacting their sense of well-being. So I would really begin as an employer, if you're noticing like folks that are, have high absentee rates, are less efficient than they used to be. More irritable. Just begin to ask what's happening for you. Like, what's coming up is a great question that I ask. Like, what's coming up for you when you're at work? What feels like a heavy lift? And then asking stories like, what is the story that you're telling yourself about why you're stressed out? right? Those are some questions that are not, I mean, they're coaching questions, but they're questions like a coach like leader could be asking. To just help them, both the employee or the staff person or your team or yourself understand that better.
It's so brilliant because we on a different episode we had another great and brilliant therapist, similar in your realm, but in a different world. They worked in the world of children who have autistic and speech difficulties and difficulty eating. And what I'm seeing is a really interesting through line here, that in all of these cases, whether it's a little child who's battling, something that they are facing in a diagnosis, or whether it's an employee, a medical professional, someone who is battling this burnout, it's all about taking the time to ask those questions. And we don't give ourselves that time.
Yes, because we are already on to the solution.
Yeah, and we don't even understand the problem. That's the thing.
Yes.
We're already on to the solution. We haven't clearly articulated the problem.
Yep. Bingo. That's a great way of naming it.
Please, Dr. Kelly, can we just, Sarah, let's both learn from Dr. Kelly for a minute, because this is a woman who goes around and counsels countries on how to organize things. Can you talk to us a little bit, Dr. Kelly, about identifying that problem, and tell us more about that for just a minute before we dive back into the medical field?
It's funny. I was talking with somebody yesterday, and we were looking at working on a project in the UK, and we just both rolled our eyes and said the government clearly doesn't understand how to articulate what the problem is. They think they have the solution, but they don't even know what the problem is. Right? And and that happens. It happens all the time, because I think, Sarah, you said something really important about being curious, and it's sort of stop, ground yourself, and listen. And try to put the pieces of the puzzle together. Try to connect those dots so that you can see the bigger picture of the problem. Too often in this quick world, we want to say, all right, here's the issue, I've solved it, check. Next thing, here's the issue, I've solved it, check. It's like you've got popcorn brain. There's a really cool study that came out in Canada about ADHD, and it's like popcorn brain. You're out and in, out and in, out and in. Drives me nuts. How do we, seriously, we have to kind of stay together and in one place at one time and breathe and look. But if we don't clearly articulate the problem, we've invested and wasted an awful lot of time on a solution. So Jenn, to come back to your really great question on how do we apply it in organizations, I don't think leaders spend the time articulating the problem because they don't care, because they're too busy on something else, because they don't know how, or because they don't know how to invest the empathy to do that. Yeah. My observation.
Yeah.
I'm going to observe, just in my own little baby as a leader, that I think one of the biggest problems with articulating the problem might be just what Sarah talked about with that medical professional who had problems with her notes. You don't want to face the problem. You you want to prove that you can solve it, but you don't really want to look. I'm going to tell a really quick silly thing, but this is a very, very feminine thing. But I grew up always trying to manage my weight, trying to be smaller, trying to, lose weight. So I would do like a Jenny Craig or a Weight Watchers, and I would go and I'd show up and I'd get all the food and I'd do, but I'm going to tell you, when I knew I hadn't eaten right, I didn't show up for that weigh-in because I didn't want to see the reality of it. And so I want to bring this back over, because I really like what we're talking about. There's this kind of popcorn brain. There's this ability to articulate the problem. And we're seeing that at the organizational level across the countries, the healthcare industries. And then we're seeing that at the individual level. Sarah, as you're working therapeutically with your clients, you're helping them individually to identify this problem. And I had in our show notes this one particular problem that you mentioned that I just thought was so interesting. I've got to bring it up. And this idea of a morale injury. And I want to know a moral injury. Okay, I thought it was like a moral injury, but a moral injury. Tell me about a moral injury. What is that? How does that play in? And we're talking about articulating the problem. Let's look at those injuries and what kind of problems those show.
So the conversation around moral injury in medical providers has been growing over the last, I would say, 5 to 8 years. And it has come out of a noticing that burnout was many people felt that burnout was a blaming the victim issue, right? It was saying like, oh, you're burned out because you're just not tough enough and you're not resilient enough. And what doctors would say were I made it through med school and residency. I passed the MCAT. I'm tough. I'm smart. I'm hardworking, I am resilient. And so they needed to name the deeper root of the stressor. And part of what happens in medicine is that we have so many levers that we can pull at this point. And the levers have become increasingly expensive to pull. And the impacts on health, on our patients' health, reach beyond what we can address. And so doctors are in constant relationship with the fact that they will be making decisions about their patients' health and well-being that may be antithetical to their values, right? And when we have to make decisions that are antithetical to our values, it's like a death by 1,000 cuts, right? It's like you're getting these little paper cuts of, on your soul, so to speak, that begin to multiply in a way that shows up as this sense of irritability and resentment and etc. Looks a lot like burnout, right? Feels a lot like burnout. It's semantics, but we can also name it as moral injury. And I think it's been an important thing to name for physicians because it is happening in the background. It is not been named for them as part of what they're experiencing. And therefore they begin to blame themselves, right? So if there is something that is systematic that is happening to you and you don't notice it, it's like the water you're swimming in, then you begin to self-blame and to take on the responsibility of solving that thing when it's not actually in your power and control to solve. So moral injury is something to really, it's important to name for physicians, and it's important to notice when it's happening and to notice how you're in relationship with it.
I like your definition. I'm glad that you went into a deeper dive to explain that. And I know Jen has a question, but if we take it out, and we can take it outside the healthcare community. I'll give an example. In a certain point in time in my career, I won't tell you when, because then you'll know how old I am. I was working with the Ministry of Transportation for the Government of Ontario, and we were going through a significant change in who does what and how we do things. And I was heading up a policy and human resource unit at the time in a particular area. And we decided to get out of the business of sort of, I'd call blue collar work.
Mm-hmm.
And we laid off about 5,000 people in an 18-month period of time. And I had 500 of those notices to deliver and families to talk to. And we did that in remote areas in Ontario. They were all men. They were mostly 55 and older. They would never have another job. They were not employable at the time. Some of them committed suicide. And after the 500th one, I had become detached from creating that letter and looking at that profile of that person and getting ready to sit down with that person, that it just became a transaction.
Yep. That compassion fatigue.
And I left. Quit.
Yeah. Because it was so antithetical.
Yeah. It was just fundamentally wrong. It was morally wrong. Policy-wise, it was right, but there was a different way to do it.
Yeah, and that's the difficult place, right? That's where many physicians are having to ask themselves the question, is this a system I can function in? Right? Is the moral injury something I can be in relationship with in a way that I can continue to be in this place and be working in this space? Or is there something that needs to change? I mean, there's tons that needs to change outside of them, but is there something that they need to change about where they're working or who they're working for or how they're in relationship with their
like I'm flabbergasted by that, because I feel like no one is immune, like that's really, no one is immune. There is no one who is immune from this opportunity to live and work and try to pursue one's passion, which, in your case, Kelly, was helping this government do these things, and Sarah, in the case of your clients, is pursuing the very best healthcare for these patients, and then having to fight with what is available, and make these kinds of decisions that are like you said, what's that word again? Say that beautiful word.
Antithetical.
Antithetical. What a word, guys. Word of the day, Resilience Podcast listeners.
Antithetical.
Because it's such an important piece of the puzzle. And I think, boy, it's deep though, Sarah. And that's where I'm wanting to bring us to a place where, because all of our listeners, I can imagine, I probably feel antithetical about a lot of that. I feel antithetical about like getting on social media. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, honestly,
Right,
there's so many
yeah.
things in life that we face that we have to have this fight with our own morals. And so I guess I want to bring it back to something actionable for our team. And we've talked about, when I say our team, but our listeners and those who are part of this resiliency community. And so we've talked about like really a lot of things. We've talked about how people face burnout, how when you first see it, it's irritability and it's coming in that way. But then really once you look down to it, it can be little tiny things that are holding us back.
Yes.
I want to look to the future of like, how do we get better? How, if Dr. Kelly had been in her job in Ontario and she had to lay off those 500 people, and maybe at person 100, if she had recognized that she was feeling irritability and resentment and other things, what might she have done to stay sane? And
My husband
continue?
did. Let me tell you.
Husband, like,
He said,
identifying some irritability.
He said, "Are we at war?" He asked me that question. He said, "Has Ontario declared war?" I said, "No." He said, "Then get a perspective."
That's so important. Thank you to the
Yes.
sweet memory of your husband, a brilliant man. Because truly, and that, Sarah, is what you're giving your clients. Because I can imagine your clients coming in and literally, I mean, listen, you have your husband saying, "Are we at war?" because you're having to fire some people. This poor doctor who is saving people's lives is freaking out because she can't do her notes. Like, are we at war? How do we put things in perspective? Sarah, from your brilliant therapeutic brain, how do we get it in perspective?
Well, I think so the first thing I begin with many of my clients and all of my residents is we do a values assessment, right? We do the work to identify 3 values that are things that are deeply intrinsically important to you. So these aren't the values of your organization. They aren't your partner's values. They're not the values that your parents gave you. Like, they are the things that are really, really deeply important to you. And then we begin to use those to define success, which is a huge one, right? Like, it's how I define success. I teach people how to set boundaries with them, right? To notice, like, you know what, this is my line in the sand, right? This isn't my wall, because I talk about how boundaries are not about creating walls. They're actually about bridges, right? They're about creating connection. And I use the values as understanding, like, when these things are coming up, which value has been violated, right? So when we're noticing resentment, when we're noticing irritability, what value do I hold really dear that is being violated? And how do I want to work with that, right? For some people, like, they don't have choice. Some people can quit their job. Some people can, make something change, and other people are stuck. Like, that's where they're at. And so, like, how are they going to then work with that? And I think when you name, well, this is the value that is being violated for me, and it's not your fault. It's not something you did that's making you feel this way. It's like, oh yeah, I'm not sure what your values are, Dr. Kelly, but I imagine in the firing of those people, there were some values that were being violated for you. And so when your husband noticed, like, are we at war? Like, this is how, it's because, like, that was what was happening for you. That was intrinsically what is important to you, was every day being stepped on multiple times a day, probably. And so how to name that and then make a decision, like, okay, what am I going to do about this? And so that's always where I begin, because I think if we can name those and utilize them, we have at least one lever that we can pull. And then we can kind of build from there. Mindfulness practice will encourage my clients deeply. And when I'm teaching my medical residents, we always begin with mindfulness, right? I teach some really simple mindfulness practices. This is not like becoming the Buddha and finding enlightenment. This is like, how do I use walking meditation to reset myself between patient rooms, right? Or from the car, into the building or from the building into the car, right? How do I use a gratitude practice? Talk about getting perspective. Start your day with a gratitude practice. That gives you some serious perspective. The people who have the greatest resilience are the people who have a gratitude perspective. Even if they don't have a practice, the data has demonstrated those are the people that just have natural resilience, are the people who can see the bright side, And this isn't like toxic positivity, only good vibes. That's not what I'm naming. But having a gratitude practice is the other. So those are the three kind of hallmarks that I would name: values, mindfulness, and a gratitude practice are a great place to begin.
You can take us to maybe what might be the next place. So you've talked about mindfulness, and I love the example you use. Mindfulness as you're walking between patient rooms.
Yeah.
And gratitude. But how do we learn how to conserve energy as well? And to not spend energy on those things that aren't worth spending energy on. How do we do that?
Well, I think that's where those three hallmarks or pillars are where you begin. And as you're practicing those, it then highlights what's coming up, right? So when we're in that mindfulness practice, once we kind of learn how to concentrate on our breathing, let's say, we notice that what is interrupting that, right? It's this story of I'm not good enough. That's what keeps coming up when I'm trying to pay attention to my breath. How can I then work with that story? Right? So that's like the next step. It's like, how do I work with these stories that are coming up that are getting in the way of me doing the things I want to do or having the energy I want to have? Because those stories are where the wasted energy is happening. Right? I have a client recently who, justice is one of his values. And one of the ways that it was feeling violated is when people around him weren't behaving in the way that he felt like was part of the social contract, right? So whether that was going into a coffee shop and someone hadn't cleared the table, or, misbehaving in the parking lot of the Costco, or whatever it was. And when he was able to name the value, he was able to notice his reaction to when that value felt violated. And then he was able to notice, wait, do I need to waste that energy on, he would get to a 10 when he would walk into a coffee shop and someone hadn't cleared the table. And he's like, is that a good use of my energy? Yes, I can notice that that's ticked me off, right? I can notice it feels like my value of justice has been trampled on. And is it worth that energy? Is it worth it to put that kind of energy in? And that 3-step process allowed him to harness so much of the energy he had wasted, because he wasn't then building an emotional experience on his initial reaction.
So you're helping us know when to go to 10 and when not to go to 10. Go, no, go.
Yeah.
We need that.
Before we started, we were chatting about the person next to me in the coffee shop yesterday who was arguing with the manager, right? And I was like, I'm not going to get to a 10. But this situation has gone to a place where my sense of you're being a bully, that was being violated. And I was like, this is a place where I'm going to spend some energy to be you're all done. She's asked you to leave. I'm going to step in here and support this person who's being bullied. But we get to choose that, right? There may be other situations where I'm that's not where I'm going to spend my energy. But most of the wasted energy becomes the stories and emotional experiences that we overlay on top of the experience that we're having in real life. My brain at 2:00 in the morning is not very nice. So that is a place where I can say oh, this is me choosing, or not, my brain is activated and is draining my energy in a way it's not actually going to be helpful to the situation. So that's a great question you have to ask yourself. Is this helpful? Is this useful?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Is this useful? Is this helping me? And I think that's what I keep hearing in all of this. So and what I just want to say back what I heard, which is in these values, you really help create a framework, because you're like, hey, you don't just ask me like, what are your values? You're like, name me 3 values. Let's get clear on what are those 3. And then that gives me a framework against which I can look at that. Then I have my mindfulness and my gratitude. So what it strikes me as is that you are building like a dashboard for all of those, all of us digital folks who've looked at that. And it makes me think, and this is it's a physical metaphor, but like, for example, this year, as you get older, your body likes to break down. And so I've met my gallbladder this year. Since we're talking about medical, I've met her.
Yeah.
She's come up and decided to tell me she exists. But in meeting her and learning how she functions and what she is, I've learned that she's a very good indicator for me, where I go, oh wait, I'm not gonna I used to love all those French fries and all that heavy food, but I call her Golly. That's her name for me. So Golly doesn't like it, because my mental state, I don't have my physical body, all of our digestive systems have a lot more control, but our minds can run and run and run and run. So what you're doing is you're helping each person to create their own dashboard, their own indicator that says, hey, wait, this, and so that we can find it earlier and we can get in there and not get too Kentucky fried. Is that
exactly?
What do you take from that?
That is it. You named it. Good. Yes. I love
Beautiful.
it. I love it. It's a dashboard. My clients, and this is such a fun conversation because it helps add to my vocabulary around this and how I think about the work I do. I had a client the other day that said to me, Sarah, you're like the iPhone. She said, before you have an iPhone, you don't realize you need an iPhone. Then you get the iPhone. You don't know how do you live without it?
Exactly. You have to put it
right.
Well, look, and congrats, because that is a dang good testimonial. Equally, I think what you bring up is so important. A shared language around this. Yeah. We all understand the pressures across the workforce. Again, we have listeners in across tech, across entertainment, across public relations and marketing, across government, and across healthcare. And we all are facing this kind of crisis of wellness and crisis of understanding. And when we pull it down through this through line of resilience, what it's coming down to is we have to practice. We have to do the work, and we have to find the opportunities to kind of work together. We talked about this in an earlier episode, but mentorship and inspiration to bring people together and really, and this is what you're doing. You're teaching people the skills, and then they can go on and teach them the skills. I wanted to ask kind of a final question before we move into our fun rapid fire discussion, but I want to wrap this up in a way, because you said in your origin story, which was really touching, you grew up medically adjacent, you've lived in this world a long time. And you saw a void in the industry of what these people need. And we've talked about how this can apply in daily life and in organizations. But I kind of want to ask, across the American healthcare system, a big trigger word right now, and that's a honest choice of words, but it's from a micro level, what could really help our doctors become more effective across the American healthcare system?
It's a great question. So I think at a small system level, not a big system level, we need to give our doctors an opportunity to notice that there is possibility, right? There is hope that they can navigate this. That there are places where they can grow their resiliency, right? That they are resilient beings, and that is a great place to start. But there's more places that they can grow into that will help them to navigate this space that's hard. Yeah, I just think it's much of the conversation around burnout has been one of no hope. And what I really hope is that we can give medical providers hope, because they love what they do. It's a calling. It is not a choice. And for most of them, and it is heartbreaking to see a physician who's gotten to the point where they say, I just can't do this anymore. And to give them the power back is, I think, the place where we can help them to be more effective. I hope that answered your question.
Did it ever give them the power back? And look, a physician without hope is like a cake without sugar. Okay, it doesn't have what it needs to give us what we need.
No.
And so I think that what we are talking about here, there's nothing more life and death than the medical field. That is
Yeah.
life and death. All right.
Yeah.
And so I would just want to applaud and say that the work that you're doing to build this resilience and to build that kind of hope, it really is a ripple effect, because that one physician that helps not only their patients, but all of the people that are with them, that faith is what is necessary to keep life going. And I think that really speaks to the power of resilience and to how that picks up. So I think with
Yeah.
that, we should kick right into our rapid fire questions. I don't know. What do you think, Dr.
All right.
Kelly?
I think it's a great idea because we've learned a lot today. You've shared so much with us. There's a lot of insights that we can take. And I think our listeners, you've given them some really powerful tools. So Jenn and I want to thank you for that very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
We're delighted, absolutely delighted, but we want to know you more. So in order to get to know you more, tell us, what's your favorite movie or TV show that makes you feel resilient?
I've been watching Shrinking lately, which is, as a therapist, like there's some really cringy, like pseudo therapeutic, interactions. You're like, that is not what therapy looks like. However, I love that what it demonstrates is kind of how people can have conflict and find resolution, and because they have a deep seated sense of love for one another. And that just, I love that. So instead of it all being like a perfectly flat, lake, it's a show that has a lot of ripples and waves, and people crash and they pick themselves back up again and they lean on each other, and there's humor. And so I love all that.
What about a song that makes you feel resilient?
So my favorite is a song by the Highwomen, who are a super group that include Brandi Carlile and Dolly Parton and a few other amazing women. If you haven't ever picked, they're amazing. And they have a song called Crowded Table, which is all about bringing together the people in your life that you love around a table, and just all that you glean from that. So that is where I find my resilience, in my people.
I'm headed to Spotify right after this because that sounds amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It is amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It's my theme song.
I love it.
What's the last thing that made you laugh out loud?
A lot. I laugh a lot. So that's a little bit tough. I think my kids often make me laugh out loud. I have 2 young adult children who are just at these really fun places in their lives. And they're very funny. My daughter in particular is very funny. So she often makes observations that are so spot on that they bring me joy and laughter.
And no filter. That's why they're so beautiful.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Yeah.
She was recently like, so have we talked to Grandma about Prozac? That was like, whoa.
Oh my word, I love your daughter.
It's just like, hey.
Oh my word. Fabulous.
Yeah, it was
It's a day, dear, but I'll put that on the list of things to do, right?
Thanks for cutting right through it and getting right to the point, honey. We love you.
What's one question that you'd like to leave for a future guest?
That's a great question. What is a way that you have really leaned into your values? It's a way that you can, I would say, what's a way you deeply lean into your values?
Love that question.
So appropriate.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Great question. Really cool. And a good way to get that framework going. All right. Now I have a question for you that was left by a past guest. Are you ready?
Oh, cool. Yep.
All right, here we go. The question is, do you worry about money? And if so, why?
I worry about money from the perspective of privilege, I would say. I feel very privileged, and I worry about how that living in that impacts the way that I think about and work with money. So, yeah.
What a beautifully sustainable, pure view. You know what I mean? It kind of matches I think what we've seen in you today, which is that you really seem to be able to look at kind of a global perspective of a challenge and feel an empathetic and a compassionate way toward that, but then also really set up values that serve that. And that's where I see in that answer is that
Thank you.
You're thinking about the whole and taking
Yeah.
care of the individual within it. And I think that really breeds resilience. So
Yeah. Thank you.
wow. Well, Sarah,
Thank you.
what a gem. I feel like I've learned a ton of
This has
things.
been
I know
really
that our
fun.
listeners have also. Where can our listeners find you if they want to learn more about you, your business,
Oh,
burnout, those
yeah.
types of things? Where can they find you online and connect with you?
Absolutely. So I am my website is a great place to start. It's sarahcarlan.com, and my name is spelled SarahCarlan because my grandmother-in-law made it up when she converted. So it's not spelled like normal people spell Carlan. Occasionally on Instagram, my newsletter and blogs come out, and I'm just in the very baby stages of potentially a podcast. That'll be out on my Instagram if and when it materializes. So yeah.
Well, we send our good vibes and energy because what you are doing is so important. We thank you for being a resilience warrior for all of these
Thank
people
you.
across the healthcare industry. And we just thank you for sharing those insights. And so from all of us and to all of you, our dear listeners, thank you for tuning in today to Resiliency, the podcast. If resilience is something that you are seeking in your life, please like us, subscribe to our channel on YouTube, give us a thumbs up, join our community. It's really important to us. Resiliency, the podcast, is the place for stories and strategies and inspiration on how to embrace change and overcome challenges and really redefine resilience in today's ever-evolving world. I'm Jenn Quader. You can find me online, JennQuader.com or at Jenn Quader on all of the socials. My dear, wonderful, brilliant, illustrious co-host, Dr. Kelly Culver. You can find her at theculvergroup.ca. That's .ca because she is a brilliant Canadian. Also find her at Dr. Kelly Culver on Instagram and LinkedIn. And guys, again, find us everywhere you listen to podcasts. Join us. And until then, stay strong, stay resilient, surf those waves of life. We thank you again. Tune in 2 weeks from now for the next Resiliency, the podcast. Thanks, guys.